Welcome to part 5 of our Lenten Bible study series. In our previous episode, we covered the Last Supper and ended with Jesus predicting that Peter was going to deny that he ever knew Jesus. Today, we're going to follow Jesus out to the Garden of Gethsemane, which is just outside of the old border of Jerusalem. We're going to listen to Jesus as he pleads with the Father and is then arrested. So let's start reading. Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to the disciples, "Sit here while I go and pray over there." And he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, and he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. Then he said to them, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even unto death. Stay here and watch with me." He went a little further and fell on his face and prayed, "O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." So let's talk about this passage. We see Jesus going through a very understandable emotion. And this particular set of passages really elevates or shows us Jesus' humanity. First of all, like any human being, he doesn't want to die. Sometimes people will ask us, if you Christians believe that there's such a great afterlife, why are you afraid to die? Well, the truth is, even Jesus was afraid to die. It's a very unnatural and unpleasant experience for us. We don't want to do it. And yet, we know that there's something better on the other side. Even still, Jesus, knowing that there's something on the other side that was better for him, was still fearful of what he was going to go through. Suffering and death is just no picnic, even for the Son of God. Now, at the same time, he says, "If it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." He says that to the Father. There was this ancient heresy called monothelitism, and it was the idea that Jesus only had one will, the divine will. And yet in this passage we see something very different. The Church teaches and solemnized in the Third Council of Constantinople that if Jesus is truly a true man, then he had a true human will. And in this passage we see Jesus bringing his human will into conformity with the divine will. So he says, "Not as I will," speaking from his human will, "but as you will," the divine will. So he had to bring his human will in line with the divine will, because his human will had the very normal and not sinful desire to not die. But he had to point his human will towards the higher good, which is the divine will. Now he says, "Let this cup pass from me." What does that mean? What does he mean by this cup? The simplest answer is that he's talking about his sufferings using a metaphor of having to drink from a cup. Theologians like Scott Hahn compare that, or rather link that, to the cup of wine, or rather the sponge of wine, which he has on the cross, which is mentioned in John's Gospel. And he thinks that this is to him referring to the completion of the Passover act, which he's going to be doing throughout the crucifixion, which is going to culminate and end with him taking that swig of wine and saying, "It is finished." Let's continue. Then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping and said, "What? Could you not watch with me for 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again, a second time, he went away and prayed, saying, "O my Father, if this cup cannot pass away from me unless I drink it, your will be done." And he came and found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went away again, and prayed a third time, saying the same words. Then he came to his disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, accompanied by a large crowd, with swords and clubs, who had come from the chief priests and the elders of the people. His betrayer had arranged a sign with them, saying, "The man I shall kiss is the one. Arrest him." Immediately he went over to Jesus and said, "Hail, Rabbi," and he kissed him. Okay, not a lot new in this section. He prays the same prayer again twice, and then he also finds them sleeping again. One question that sometimes people come up with when they're reading these passages is, how did the disciples know what Jesus was saying if they were asleep? But the question isn't quite as difficult as people may imagine. Jesus wasn't very far away. He was only about, a stone's throw away. And it's not like they fell asleep instantly upon him walking away. They would have heard what he was praying, at least the first 2 times that he woke them up and went back over. So it's not that big of a mystery to know why it is that they knew what words he was praying. It just, they fell asleep after a while of him doing this. Another thing to point out, and this is something of a Catholic issue, is that Jesus prays the same prayer 3 times. Now, why is this relevant? Well, there's this translation which is commonly cited in Protestant circles of Matthew chapter 6, verse 7, where Jesus admonishes people at the Sermon on the Mount not to pray in vain repetitions, as it is translated by the King James Version. And sometimes non-Catholics will look at that and they'll see Catholic devotions such as the Hail Mary prayer or the Rosary, and they'll say, you guys are in violation of God's word because you guys pray in vain repetitions. You repeat your prayers. Now, the thing is, if it was really illicit to repeat your prayers, then Christ himself would be in violation of his own word by repeatedly praying this prayer that we read him praying at the Garden of Gethsemane, not just 3 times, but presumably for 3 hours he prays this prayer. So it is not illicit to pray something repetitiously. What Jesus was really getting at in Matthew chapter 6, verse 7, was rather praying at length because they believe they'll be heard for speaking for a long time. God knows what you want even on the first time you pray it. So what Jesus is really saying is, don't think you're going to wear down God as if you need to pray for a long time in order for him to hear you. Okay, now we're going to do something a little bit weird. In previous Bible studies, I've brought in little snippets from other Gospels where I thought that they added a relevant detail, and now we're just going to go full bore on that. What I've done here is I've assembled a compilation of all the different Gospels to try to incorporate all the details that all the Gospel writers put into this next interaction, because each Gospel has little nuggets that are worth meditating upon. So I'm going to read this straight, and you can see on the left side of the screen where I'm pulling this from. Jesus said to him, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" And his disciples realized what was about to happen, and they asked the Lord, "Lord, shall we strike with the sword?" Jesus said to Judas, "Friend, do what you have come for." Then, stepping forward, he said to them, "Whom are you looking for?" They answered him, "Jesus, the Nazarene." He said to them, "I am." And when he said to them, "I am," they turned away and fell to the ground. So again he asked them, "Whom are you looking for?" They said, "Jesus the Nazarene." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am. So if you are looking for me, let these other men go." And they laid hands on Jesus and arrested him. So let's talk about what happens in this section. First, Jesus is betrayed by Judas, who reveals which one of them is Jesus. In this crowd, it was probably dark and difficult to tell who was who. And so Judas approaches him and reveals which one of them is Jesus. Now his disciples realize what's about to happen. They know that he's about to be hauled before the Sanhedrin and tried for crimes. And so they're asking Jesus, are we supposed to be striking at them with the sword? Because in Luke's Gospel, chapter 22, it says that they have 2 swords. But Jesus doesn't reply to them immediately. Instead, he looks at the crowd that's arrived, and he challenges them and says, "Who are you looking for?" And when they say, "We're looking for Jesus," he says, "I am," which, if you recall, is the name of God, the holy name of God, given to Moses in the book of Exodus. And so it says that the power of Jesus, the divine Christ, uttering his own name, knocks them to the ground in a very Lord of the Rings style moment. You can pass over it very easily if you're not reading slowly. But he says, "I am," and it knocks them over, dumbfounds them, the power of Jesus uttering his own divine name. And so they have to get up, reorient themselves, and Jesus says, "Here I am," and then they lay hands on him to arrest him. Let's continue. Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's slave, and cut off his right ear. The slave's name was Malchus. Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into its scabbard. Shall I not drink the cup the Father gave me? For all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you not think that I cannot call upon my Father, and he will not give me at this moment more than 12 legions of angels? But then how would the scriptures be fulfilled which say that it must come to pass in this way?" Then he touched the servant's ear and healed him. So, just something to point out in this section is that both Matthew and John's Gospel say in different ways that Jesus is not an unwilling victim. He is going willingly, and he is in charge of the situation. He could end it at a moment's notice if he wanted to. In John's Gospel, he puts people on the ground by uttering the divine name. In Matthew's Gospel, he says that he could call down 12 legions of angels if he just wanted to. Jesus could scour the earth clean at a moment's notice if he wasn't willing to go through with the crucifixion. And we'll close with the following. And at that hour, Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out against me as a robber, with swords and clubs to seize me? Day and night I sat teaching in the temple area, yet you did not arrest me. But all this has come to pass that the writings of the prophets may be fulfilled." Then all the disciples left him and fled. So in this closing section, Jesus is basically calling them out for being cowards. It's true, Jesus had all week long been in the temple teaching in public. If they wanted to arrest him, they could have done so at any moment if he was truly doing something wrong. But they didn't. Instead, they waited till the dead of night and surreptitiously found a way to get him without anyone knowing. This is reminiscent of what Jesus says in John 3:20, where he says, "Everyone who does evil hates the light and will not come into the light for fear that their deeds will be exposed." In this instance, they decided to take Jesus in the dead of night where no one could see it, and they don't have to fear any reprisals from the public. One final note as we close. In the book of Genesis, we see that the fall of mankind begins in a garden with an act of disobedience. And here in the Gospels, we see that the redemption of mankind on Holy Thursday night begins in a garden with an act of Christ's obedience. I'll see you next time.